Well, the protection of personal information was top of the agenda at this year's International Data Privacy Day webinar. The event was hosted by the Information Regulator together with the IEC and Media Monitoring Africa. The theme this year is Misinformation, Disinformation and Data Protection during the election period. It coincides with the upcoming 7th General National and Provincial elections in South Africa, where political parties will be expected to adhere to the Popi Act. That's the Popi Act. So let's get insights on this webinar, as well as the other issues that were ventilated there. Bring in the Information Regulator's Advocate Collen, who joins us now via our video link. And Advocate Collen, it's lovely to speak to you. Thanks very much indeed for making time. Perhaps let's begin with a bit of context around what this webinar is actually aiming to do, because, of course, as many people know, the electoral process in its very nature involves at its core us giving away very intimate details around who we are in order, of course, to make sure that the election itself has integrity.
Good morning, Ayanda, and good morning to your viewers. Yes, indeed, and of course, you've hit the nail on the head. So the personal information that each and every one of us own and possess becomes an integral part of the election process, and it's very key that such information is protected and that processing of personal information happens in compliance with the provisions of Popi Act, or the protection of personal information. So each and every voter that is registered is then also called, in our language, a data subject. And a data subject's information is supposed to be processed in compliance with the provisions, as I've mentioned just now.
Right. And what does that protection entail, Advocate Collen? Because, for example, in other elections, you might get a random call from a political party, even though you've never really overtly expressed interest in whatever they're trying to sell. Are data subjects, as you mentioned, protected from something like that? Should they be protected?
Thank you, Ayanda. That's a very important question. In fact, during the webinar, the chairperson of the Information Regulator, in her opening statement, made a very important statement which actually refers to these lists or marketing lists that are being sold, which are not in compliance with the provisions of Popi Act. And that becomes a very important question, because what the voters or the data subjects usually are concerned about is, where did you obtain my personal information from? And according to the Protection of Personal Information Act, the information that you process must be obtained directly from the data subject. And that becomes a key point to mention. And there's a lot of concern with regards to how the information is obtained and how the information is processed. Also, when political parties, for instance, would send you messages, or would want to call you, these robocalls and emails and all sorts of messages that we see. And the test really becomes also Section 69(1) of the Protection of Personal Information. Together with it, we also have developed, as the Information Regulator, a guidance note on the processing of personal information of a voter, and that was the very first guidance note that we've compiled during 2019, and that guidance note will be updated as we continue our journey towards the 2024 election period.
Is it easy to track how that information arrives at those who essentially carry out these marketing campaigns? Because in my mind, it's not easy to kind of find who's culpable for something like that. I mean, you could ask, for instance, a political party to give you answers, but if they've hired a third party to do this for them, they might claim ignorance.
Correct. And that's a very important point that you're making, Ayanda. In fact, the Information Regulator is aware of the number of data breaches or security compromises that have occurred over a 5-year period, we might say. And what is also very important is the ITC security compromise, in which more than 20 million people's personal information was compromised. And that makes it every more difficult for us to determine how the information was obtained. But very importantly, we also know that the selling of marketing lists, as was widely reported, is also a huge concern, but it becomes extremely difficult to track and trace how and where the information was obtained from. There was also various concerns raised on Metro FM regarding how do we access complexes and how our information is recorded and stored and distributed and disseminated, which all got to do with the processing aspect. And those aspects makes it also very difficult because you don't know where your information will end up. And that becomes key points for the information regulator to investigate. In fact, we've got a few cases that we're dealing with concerning direct marketing, which involves the processing of personal information of data subjects.
Right, and I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this, Advocate. The sanction, right? How do you hold anybody accountable when it's difficult to kind of find the source of the breach, for lack of a better term? I know the Information Regulator has kind of only started exploring and wrestling with these type of questions. Are we any closer to answering them?
Yes, of course. We've developed and we have, in fact, have our compliance requirements in place. And key to that is that we are now having an enforcement committee which can write recommendations and findings to the members of the Information Regulator, which will then culminate into what we would call, and this is very important for the public to note, an enforcement notice. Failure to comply with an enforcement notice will then result in our penalty regime being activated. That will now be through an infringement notice, and that infringement notice becomes very important because it contains a penalty regime as well as a criminal sanctions. So up to 10 million rand fine or up to 10 years imprisonment. And those are very strict conditions and requirements. And that is also the own initiative investigations that we conduct, that is in terms of Section 76.3, but we also have the Section 89.1 route, which is the own initiative assessments that the Information Regulator can invoke to actually investigate or assess how and where the information was obtained from. And the Information Regulator is currently having a few of those investigations and assessments underway.
Sure. The theme this year is also very important for this webinar, right? Misinformation, disinformation, and data protection during the election period. If history is anything to go by, we know that elections anywhere in the world are contested online sometimes, right? And it could have a material difference on the outcomes of that particular election. What's the Information Regulator's approach to this, given the very unique circumstances we find ourselves in this country and in the rest of the world? I have no doubt that a lot of the electioneering will be a battle of the facts, frankly.
Correct. Ayanda, Mr. Simon Mabolo, the CEO of the IEC, gave us a breakdown, and you would know that the youth uses these social media tools aggressively, and they, between the age of 18 to 34, constitute 50% of the voters. And what is important is that we are alive to the fact, but it's also very important to understand what's happening internationally. So internationally, we've dealt with the Cambridge Data Analytica sort of like very informative security compromise, which affected even 405,000 of our Facebook users. And what is important is that the information was manipulated, the personal information of users. So you're quite correct. And what the Information Regulator, in consultation and in conjunction with the partners like the IEC, Media Monitoring Africa, also the Center for Human Rights in Pretoria, are doing is to actually ensure that there are proactive measures in place. One of the tools that were actually developed, local innovation it's called, is the Real 411 web tool, which will also ensure that discussions and conversations which can impact those type of election outcomes are monitored, but also that any false, mis or disinformation is reacted upon swiftly. In fact, within a space of 45 minutes, it's anticipated. But of course, monitoring becomes a burden because of the number of platforms, the number of people, and the voters, and the communication. So, but there are some steps and proactive measures that have been put in place by the partners of the IEC, like the Information Regulator.
Yeah, we certainly hope so. That synergy is going to come in handy given what's at stake come the elections. Advocate Collen Weapon, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. We really appreciate your time on the AM report today.